Hello and welcome to another standard video. Today we're taking a look at one of the more ridiculous decks I've played in recent memory, a black-green Insidious Roots deck with the addition from Aetherdrift, which adds quite a few cards to the archetype, although our build around is still Insidious Roots, a 2-mana enchantment, saying creature tokens we control can tap for 1 mana of any color, and whenever one or more creature cards leave our graveyard, we get to make an 0/1 plant token, as well as putting a +1/+1 counter on each plant we control, so by default we essentially get a 1/2 plant token, as well as growing the rest. And there's a lot of ways we can trigger Insidious Roots in this deck, since we have effects that can return creatures out of the graveyard back to our hand, which will trigger it, as well as cards that can exile cards from our graveyard, which also satisfy its condition. And the curve we're really hoping for is a turn 2 Insidious Roots into a turn 3 Tyvar Jubilant Brawler, which can now -2, milling 3 cards and returning a creature with mana value 2 or less from our graveyard to the battlefield, which will satisfy Insidious Roots condition, making a plant token. And thanks to Tyvar's passive, we may activate abilities of creatures we control as though those creatures had haste. So the plant tokens we generate can now immediately tap for mana, allowing us to empty out our hand and trigger Insidious Roots a bunch more. And then we start looking at some of our new additions from Aetherdrift, such as Mold Tender, a 1-mana 1/1 insect druid, can tap to mill a card, or can tap exiling a card from our graveyard, adding 1 mana of any color. So initially it can be a way to fill our graveyard, but soon enough we can start making mana with a Mold Tender, and by exiling a creature from our graveyard, we can make a mana of any color, as well as triggering Insidious Roots, since we've removed a creature out of our graveyard, which will make another plant token for us. And of course, Mold Tender can immediately activate with Tyvar in play as well, so if we maybe return a Mold Tender with a -2, or Mold Tender can immediately start making more mana for us. And then at 1 mana we also have the full set of Snarling Gorehound, which lets us surveil 1 whenever another creature we control with power 2 or less enters, which is pretty easy whenever we make a plant token, since those plant tokens, even if they end up getting quite large, start out as creatures with power 2 or less, so those will let us surveil, so we can keep filling the graveyard, so we can keep enabling our graveyard synergies. And then we also have the Rubble Belt Maverick, which lets us surveil 2 when it enters the battlefield, so that can also help fill the graveyard. And then once it's in the graveyard, if we happen to mill it, we can still exile it by paying a green and then put a +1/+1 counter on a creature we control. So then by exiling the Maverick, we also trigger the roots, and then the +1 counter also has excellent synergy with Agatha's Soul Cauldron, which is another way to enable Insidious Roots by exiling creatures from our own graveyard if we tap it. And then every activated ability of those creatures we've exiled, we can now transfer to every creature we control that has a +1/+1 counter, which is quite convenient because all our plants will have +1/+1 counters on them. And then the creature we really want to exile with Soul Cauldron is another new addition from Aetherdrift, Loot the Pathfinder. A Temur colored card in a black-green deck is not easy to cast, although not impossible, because we do have Mold Tender as well as the plant tokens that can make a mana of any color, so that's how we can still potentially hardcast Loot, but for the most part we're hoping to mill it and then exile it out of the graveyard with Soul Cauldron, and now every creature with a +1 counter will have all 3 of these exhaust abilities. And we can also use Cauldron to fix our colors, as we can now spend mana as though it were mana of any color to activate abilities of creatures we control, so we don't specifically need blue mana to draw 3 cards or red mana to deal 3 damage, and if we make enough plants, all those plants essentially convert into enough damage to win the game on the spot. So that's our eventual game plan. And then rounding out the deck, we also have Dredger's Insight as another new addition from Aetherdrift, a 2-mana enchantment. When it enters, we mill 4 cards, putting an artifact, creature, or land from among them into our hand. So it can also hit an Agatha Soul Cauldron, which is quite convenient. And then whenever 1 or more artifacts and or creature cards leave our graveyard from now on, we also gain 1 life. So that incidental life gain also adds up, especially once we start going off with our Insidious Roots and Tyvar. And then the Osteomancer Adept is also a pretty powerful addition from Bloomburrow that lets us tap it, and then until end of turn we may cast creature spells from our graveyards by foraging in addition to paying their other costs. Foraging means either we sacrifice a food token, which we're not going to generate in this deck, or we exile 3 cards from our graveyard, and those could also be some of our lands that we've milled that we don't have another use for. And then by foraging, let's say we do exile a creature as an additional cost, and also return a creature from from the graveyard by casting it, that counts as 2 separate Insidious Roots triggers, so that way we can generate 2 plants for every Insidious Roots we have in play, so that can also add up. And then of course the Adept's ability we can also potentially exile with the Soul Cauldron, so all our creatures can use that ability from now on. And if we control Tyvar and just put an Osteomancer in play, we can still immediately activate it, so we don't have to worry about summoning sickness. And then last but not least, the Black Overlord can be impended for 2 mana as another cheap way to fill the graveyard, and then we can return any non-avatar creature or planeswalker from our graveyard to our hand, so it can also be a card that was already in the graveyard previously, another great way to trigger Insidious Roots or maybe Dredger's Insight to gain more life, and it's still a creature that we can maybe exile out of the graveyard to enable more of our synergies like Insidious Roots, so I'm playing this over some of the alternatives at 2 mana, like the various instants and sorceries that could also fill the graveyard for us, which are still options. And then the mana base also finally gets the Black-Green Verge land, so that's also a nice improvement for all Black-Green decks going forward. We've got the Mortuary to surveil one, which still helps enable our various synergies, and then more untapped dual lands with the Llanowar Wastes and Blooming Marsh, just 2 of each basic, since we would prefer every land to make both colors, and we do have a relatively low land count, since we only really top out our curve at 3 mana. So yeah, that's our deck. Now let's jump into some games and see how the deck does. Okay, we're on the draw, and sure, I'll try this. Roots into Tyvar is the plan. Facing black-white Scavengers, so it could be Esper Pixie. And I'll keep a land on top. The opponent making me discard can sometimes be an advantage if we have loot stuck in hand, as we see the Nightmare already. Can let go of a Maverick. Now what I don't want to see is Sheltered by Ghosts exiling my Insidious Roots, since we're not playing removal to get it back. So that's one of the pretty strong cards in the Esper build. Okay, they might just be keeping up removal like Nowhere to Run to answer one of my creatures. So yeah, I think we just go for Tyvar. And then I can still follow up with Gorehound if we get a plant. And we know we can at least get back the Maverick. And Moltender is even better, since that can immediately activate, which also triggers the Roots. Although I think I still play Gorehound first, so we keep surveilling. And then now I can exile a card. Trigger Roots. And we're looking for more copies of Insidious Roots at this point, as well as wanting to mill loot. And +1 counter can go on. Kind of thinking Gorehound. So everything ends up with a +1 counter once we get Cauldron plus loot going, and there's loot. So I can actually still play the Cauldron. Exile loot. Put counter on maybe the Moltender now. And then Gorehound can exhaust. Dredger's Insight I'm probably okay keeping, although it doesn't find additional copies of Insidious Roots, so it's not a priority. Could keep going with Overlord, but I kind of like passing, and then respond to an enchantment to take out a Scavenger. Entity Tracker I guess I can take out as well. Does mean I guess I lose Tyvar. Is that worth it? Yeah, we have another one in hand, that's fine. Just don't want them drawing any cards if I can help it. So that was a pretty impressive turn. Was that turn 3? Can be right. I think it actually was, since we got back the Moltender and kept going from there. Wow. So Tyvar down, but that's not a concern. Overlord could also get it back. So there's synergy aplenty. I guess I just keep the actual Tyvar. And our opponent scoops it up. Yeah, they're just desperately behind. Awesome, on to the next one. Okay, we're on the play. Loot insists on being in our opener, and can't really keep. This is better. And then I might just keep 3 lands and get rid of 1 insight. Although insight can trigger roots, which in turn makes mana. So I could talk myself into trying it this way. Facing blue-white. And looks like the Oculus build. Not the best at dealing with a bunch of large flyers. But yeah, hopefully they don't have too much relevant interaction for us. Play the roots, next turn insights could already trigger the roots, or we can immediately go for Tyvar. Especially if it's not going to be under any pressure. Although we do need to be lucky enough to hit a creature among the top 3. Opponent could already have a helping hand for Jin. And yeah, looks like they have it. Turn 2, that's impressive. Only capable of doing it thanks to the Surveil lands. So now I'm less into playing Tyvar, because it's just going to get taken out by the Jin most likely. So instead we'll Insight. And I'll take the land. Could make it the Surveil land actually. Even though it didn't trigger roots. Already have Cauldron. Alright, so now we just need to get some creatures going with the roots, and then Cauldron plus loot is quite powerful. Founding starts from Chapter 1 for Prankster, which mills Oculus and gets back Recommission, which our opponent can still cast thanks to the discount. So yeah, pretty much the perfect start for opponents. Under a lot of pressure from these flyers. So I pretty much need to go off in 1 big turn with Tyvar. Can't really play it unless I'm ready to win in the very same turn. But for now, probably looking at Dredger's Insight. Maybe Cauldron to use loot. And then I'll go for the Overlord now. So we get a Plains, gain some life. Yeah, I could also use Overlord, but that doesn't trigger roots if we get back Tyvar. So I think Cauldron's still the most mana efficient play we can make. Also would have been, I guess, a way to stop the opponent's graveyard synergies to an extent. So we'll wait and see if anything else gets targeted. And Get Lost could also be a problem, since that blows up enchantments. Cauldron could technically shrink down the Haughty Djinn as well. So don't expect a lethal attack right now. But they're definitely building up to one. And someone can bounce my plane, so that's annoying. Opponent goes to attackers. I can block the face down card. And then exile a creature. Just to grow the plants. Don't have to go for loot yet, but I guess it's my only option. And then our opponent's going to bounce the plants. But my other plant will still have loot's exhaust ability. Alright, so that happens. Alright, so I need to make it count now. So I might start with Tyvar minus. Or I could play Maverick first to set up the top of my deck. But I pretty much want to mill whatever I can find here. Didn't find any creatures yet. So we definitely need a creature. Found a Gorehound, which also triggers roots. Keep milling. Alright, so now I can use Cauldron, although there's no creature at the moment. So I might have to just make mana. So make mana of any color. Exhaust to make 3 black. Impend. Okay, can get back another Tyvar or just a Gorehound, which I can still cast. Which can keep filling the graveyard to enable my other synergies. Exile Molt Tender. So now, let's say the Maverick can also make mana for me while triggering roots. So we're starting to go off. Can also, of course, exhaust to draw. But yeah, let's exile a card from my graveyard, make a mana. If we find Osteomancer, we can start casting creatures out of the graveyard as well. Use that to make 3 mana. Use that to draw. Play Maverick. Keep roots. And then I still have an untapped land. Can draw, but I will be short of casting the roots. Do I need to deal damage with this? I'm taking 15 in the air, so I'm probably not surviving here. So I guess what's my option? Can also trigger roots, exile a creature using the Molt Tender's ability. Is that better? Alright, looks like we timed out, so it didn't matter. Can still gain 2 life, but that's probably not enough. Recommission Oculus, that's fine. Could have also kept enough red mana available to just shoot one of the opponent's creatures with double exhaust. So opponent's attacking for 14 in the air, which is something I would survive at the moment. But they likely have more instants to grow the Djinn. Keep roots on top. Could activate the plant still to gain 2 more. So we can kind of chain this together. Exile things that I cannot get back with Tyvar. Still want to draw the roots. Alright, so I'm taking 15. Okay, we can let damage happen. Or I could exhaust to draw 3. It's a little risky if they have more instants, but I feel like they would have gone for it now. So damage happens. Okay, we get to untap. So, turns out that the Mold Tender's ability actually saved us as opposed to loot. Recommission another Oculus, that's fine. So our opponent gets a million manifests, but we get to untap with double roots. I'm pretty sure we can figure out lethal from here. Just gotta act quickly, since we might time out otherwise. So step 1, definitely play roots. We wanna try and make as many plants as possible. Mold Tender can immediately activate. Probably didn't want to tap my plant there, but that's alright. Finding an Osteomancer would be pretty useful for speeding up the process. So I'll cast another one here. Trigger Gorehound. There's Osteomancer, so I can put it in the graveyard, exile it with Cauldron, so all my creatures will have that ability as long as they have a counter. Put it on a creature that doesn't already have a counter. Keep milling. We almost have our entire library in our graveyard now, although could still use an extra Insidious Roots, so that's what we're looking for. Don't need Tyvar. Alright, so now we have 7 cards remaining, just double checking that I still have a roots left. There's 1. So I could try and draw into it. So let's make some green. Exile a creature. Surveil. Surveil again. And then I guess we'll use the Osteomancer's ability. So I can play cards out of the graveyard, including another loot if I really wanted to. But I'll just exile 2 non-creatures and 1 creature. Get a bunch more triggers, 2 for each Insidious Roots. And we should be able to find the rest of our deck, including the last Insidious Roots. Although, I suppose I can draw into it since there's only 2 cards left in my deck. And loot draws 3 cards at once. So I guess we'll have to make it work without the Insidious Roots. That's alright. So we just want to cast a few creatures, exhaust to make mana so we don't run out. This is where the game starts lagging, when I try to exhaust a creature to make mana. When I was testing the deck against Sparky, I also had this come up. Play Mold Tender, exiling 2 non-creatures and a creature. So it's almost time to start firing up the plants to either take out creatures or take out the opponent directly. Could probably auto-order triggers now too, just to speed things up a little bit. Yeah, maybe getting back Gorehound was not to play, since it's just giving me more triggers. It's alright, we'll just play Maverick. Again, exiling 2 non-creatures and a creature to maximize our roots triggers. And then the easiest path forward is probably just shooting down enough of the opponent's blockers where I can attack with the plants right now. The plants are going further than my screen. But I think I'm probably going to time out before I get a chance to attack here after taking out enough of the opponent's creatures. So then the plan might be to exhaust enough of my creatures during the opponent's turn to just deal 20 damage, which is going to take a lot of clicking, but I do want to maximize the number of plants I have for that to work, which means probably just casting another Osteomancer here. Probably should have tapped my land, but that's alright. We're running out of time, so we can't play optimally. Get some more plants. I doubt that I have enough lethal attackers here to force the opponent to jump in any meaningful fashion. So, 1 creature basically generates 2 mana, which then lets 2 creatures exhaust to deal 6. So every 3 creatures I have 6 damage. So if we do the math here, pretty sure we have enough for lethal. But yeah, it's going to have to happen during the opponent's turn, and I'm probably still going to time out if we're being realistic. I guess I'm at 22, but that's not going to be enough to survive. Yeah, my land doesn't even make mana fast enough for me to tap it. Yeah, the game is just having troubles keeping up. No attacks. Even though we've got a few healthy plant tokens that could attack. Yeah, the game really struggles once you get this many plants in play. I don't know what this Osteomancer is doing here, floating. Oh. Yeah, I guess we'll just pass at this point. Can untap a plant. Pass a turn. Or I could make some mana to exhaust now. And already deal a little bit of damage. So 3 mana. Doesn't matter that it's green, since I can still just convert it thanks to Cauldron. Exhaust. Might be easier to just deal with their creatures, so I get an extra untap step. Alright, we got our target in just in time, I think. So that's the end of my turn. So now there's just 18 power in the air. And still plenty of exhaust to be had. So our opponent goes to attackers. Let's do the math. 3, 6, 9, 12, 15... It's hard to keep track of how many creatures we actually have. But yeah, the plan might just be to shoot the Oculus and then just win with regular damage. Might be easier than trying to deal 20 damage. Alright, so step 1. Make mana with 1 plant. Then exhaust a plant to make 3 mana. I'll maybe do it once again. And then we can start shooting stuff. Alright, so our opponent scoops it up, thank god. This was going to take a while to actually go through all the motions. So you can see that even though the deck is incredibly powerful, it is still difficult to pilot just because of the technical limitations of Arena, and yeah, there's something with the exhaust ability that makes the game even laggier than it would normally be with this many tokens and +1 counters in play. So yeah, it's definitely a struggle, but you can see the potential here. On to the next one. Okay, we're on the play, sadly missing green mana, although with Surveil from Gorehound we can maybe still get this hand to be functional. Just play Gorehound, Surveil, so even though we might miss our land on turn 2, we're somewhat likely to find it by turn 3, and then we don't have many non-green sources left in the deck. Still feels a little sketchy. Alright, this is better. So I have a turn 1 Molt Tender, a loot we don't want in our hand for the most part. And then a turn 2, I could already play the Insight. Yeah, that seems okay. And then we'll see if we have a 1-drop we need to cast. Can get back Cauldron. And we'll just hit for 1. So we've got Cauldron, Tyvar. Just missing a loot in the graveyard now. And I guess our roots would be nice. Momentum Breaker gets our Molt Tender. But Tyvar could immediately get it back. Is that the plan? Yeah, I think so. So Molt Tender it is. And we'll just pass. Don't think I want to exile the Maverick until we find roots. Slasher could be an issue. Although we can still chum block it. Oh, nice. There's our Insidious Roots. So now we're talking. I can start by playing it. And then Molt Tender can exile a creature, which triggers the roots. Make it, I guess, exile Maverick, since I might want to get the Molt Tender's ability with Cauldron at some point. So that triggers, the plant will immediately tap for mana as well, and we can untap it with Tyvar. And then could even play the Adept, exile 3, and still be able to play a creature out of the graveyard as well. Yeah, that seems good to me. So a few ways I can go about it. Let's say we make a green mana here. And then we want to activate the Osteomancer. And then maybe just play the Molt Tender. And I could exile a creature in the process, so we get 2 plant tokens. And then I could still play Soul Cauldron, just to get that in play. And then plus Tyvar, untapping my Death Toucher. So that can also trade for the Slasher. And I could technically still activate Cauldron, although there's no creatures left in graveyard. So now we're just hoping to mill more creatures. Nowhere to run. Going for Molt Tender, so that will get exiled. That's fine. I guess I could still mill a card. And we actually found loot. That's amazing. Cauldron can exile it, which will also make a plant. Opponent's got another nowhere to run. So I can still use Cauldron just to get a plant, although I suppose that can wait. Slasher is probably just going face. No, still going for Tyvar. I do want to save Tyvar. Exile loot triggers roots. And can put the counter on the Mole Tender, so everyone has a counter. I'll jump to keep Tyvar alive. And then next turn we can go crazy with Loot's ability, since every one of these creatures can use the exhaust from Loot. One of them can maybe end up drawing 3 cards, could also damage the Slasher to just take it out. And the Cauldron also fixes for our colors, so we can activate those abilities as though we had mana of any color, so we don't have to worry about specifically making blue or red. So yeah, we're definitely going off. Sweet, on to the next one. Okay, we're on the draw. This hand is missing Tyvar. A way to maybe cast Loot through Mole Tender and Insidious Roots is still possible, so I'll keep it. Facing red. Yeah, I'll start with Mole Tender, can maybe make some extra mana for us. Also an enabler for Insidious Roots. Torch exiles it in fact, so might not be the typical mono-red aggro. Impact Tremors, so more of a tokens deck. Alright, so could still go for Roots, and then next turn Overlord triggers Roots most likely. Could also help find Tyvar. I see, this just maybe a Goblins deck. So at least we don't need to worry about board wipes. And Dredger's Insight could also trigger Roots if we find a creature. Which we did, and we did mill Loot as well. So even though I don't really want Maverick in hand, it still enables Roots, so that's good enough. Another Insight might be good enough, since that can gain me more life. Which also helps against the Goblins. Don't think they necessarily have a pump spell, because they're incentivized to attack with a 1/1. And now Seer Slicer makes another token, so yeah, we're taking a lot of damage. I guess never mind, Firebrand can finish off my plant. So it's not looking great. Could go with the Gorehounds and then Insight, in the hopes that we actually make a plant. And then probably go for the Overlord. So I gain 2, make a plant token, Surveil, and now we're looking for a land for next turn. Cauldron would be nice. More Insidious Roots and Tyvar, although Overlord could also get Tyvar back out of the graveyard if we mill him. We're at 6, opponent gets another token end of turn. Ooh, and Krenko. Krenko is going to be pretty lethal if our opponent gets to untap with it. Drew another Roots, although we don't have Tyvar for the tokens to immediately make mana. So I might still be dead here, especially with Krenko. Yeah, I don't really see a realistic way out. So I can get back a creature, but wouldn't be able to cast it. Make 2 plants, gain some life. Still looking for Tyvar more than anything else. And that should be lethal with Krenko activating and triggering Impact Tremors. GG's. So, yeah, not an ideal start. Missed a few line drops and couldn't really get our engine going. Still missing Tyvar. But, yeah, without Krenko, it's possible that we would have been able to stabilize from here. On to the next one. Okay, we're on the draw. This hand's not perfect. Loot is a card we would rather have in our graveyard, even though Moltender could eventually help cast it. Yeah, I'm mostly looking for roots in my opening hands, so I'll take a mulligan. And I think I prefer this. A loot can go to the bottom. We'll have to take some damage to play my black spells initially. But we've got good ways to fill the graveyard and hopefully manipulate the top of our deck. What's up with all this graveyard hate? Alright, well, that's not what I wanted to see. Although at least it's not a rest in peace. A wild guide. So the only explanation for Lantern is that our opponent's playing Bright Glass Gearhulk, and so it's kind of a one-off that they can search up, that they just happen to draw. So, could go for Roots, which at least can still trigger through the Soul Guide Lantern. Or I could play another Gorehound to set up my next draw step. This is exile each opponent's graveyard if they sack it, so I don't really want to use the Overlord necessarily. Yeah, I'll play the Roots and hit for 1. For now, a Lenor Elves and Salvagers. So yeah, this is a Collector's Cage deck, likely with Gearhulk. Kind of want him to use the Lantern before I put more stuff in the graveyard. So for now it is maybe Overlord with Impend. And get back Tyvar. Getting back my creature would have triggered Roots to make a plant, which would have been nice. But Tyvar can get back the 1-drop if we draw land number 3. There's a Collector's Cage. We'll see how lucky our opponent gets with the Hideaway. And yep, that's about as lucky as they can get. Overlord of the Mistmoors. So we're in trouble. And our opponent still has a Lantern available. I do get to play Tyvar at least.
Let's make it a fight to remember. Your story's not finished yet.
Trigger Roots. Moltender can immediately make mana. And if I exalt Overlord, that will also trigger Roots. Is their opponent deciding if they want to pull the trigger on Soul Guide Lantern? Loot I'll happily put in the graveyard. Although probably I'm not going to get the chance to use Cauldron on it. Another Roots is something I would prefer to draw. Although that's probably not happening here. So then I might have to just keep milling. I guess Loot could technically draw into it, but yeah, I don't think that's really happening here. So, exile a card to make mana. Overlord. Trigger Roots, trigger Gorehound. So yeah, what's the plan? Play Cauldron, try and target Loot, or opponent exiles it instead. And then hope to survive another turn to keep going. So one way or the other, we're still getting a plant token here. Alright, opponent lets us exile Loot. And then put counter here. And then keep the Roots. So now we can start exhausting. See, I could make a mana with a plant, turn that into 3 mana by exhausting, draw by exhausting, have 2 mana left. Yeah, that's not quite going to be enough to survive here. So I'll just pass. So I can only really deal 3 damage here, not 6, because I still need to pay a mana to activate the exhaust ability. Recruit. And does that resolve? I guess so. We'll see how they attack. They are sending 1 token at Tyvar. Everyone's going face. Opponent reconsiders. Alright, both tokens at Tyvar, so I wouldn't be able to save Tyvar. So I need to chump the Overlord, because otherwise they give this trample and I take lethal, so I may as well save myself 6 damage. But I can at least still draw. So let's say this makes a mana. And then this exhausts. I do not have Tyvar anymore, so my plants won't be able to tap for mana right away. So that's potentially a problem. But I do have a lot of mana available with what I have in play at the moment. So let's say we start with another Roots. And then I'm gonna wanna probably make mana. Play Gorehound first. Surveil. And we're just looking for creatures. So now we could try and exile the Osteomancer. See if they respond with the Lantern. They don't. So now Moltender also has Loot's ability. Another Roots I could try to draw into. But what we really need is Tyvar. So I think we keep digging. Alright, so now I play another Maverick, I guess. Still no Tyvar. So next up, I guess I gotta make mana. Can make mana again. And then now I need to draw. Hoping to find Tyvar. We actually did. Okay, so play Tyvar, or first actually go for Maverick. Trigger Root some more. And then as soon as I play Tyvar, all my plants can make mana for me. Just gonna keep on milling. I'm probably gonna time out here before I get to complete my whole turn, because I do need to take a couple more actions. Play Tyvar. Probably just gonna minus right away, since that also triggers roots. Go for Osteomancer. Trigger Gorehound and Roots. Keep milling. So all my plants can exhaust as well. So the goal would be to eventually deal lethal to the opponent. Do have to be somewhat careful here, because we are running out of cards in the library. So let's say we make a mana. This can exhaust, making more mana. This can activate. Okay, and then we'll exhaust to make more mana. Make it black. Then play another Roots. Opponent's just letting it all happen. Moltender can make extra mana. Exile 2 lands and a creature. Triggering Roots 2 times each, so that's 6 more tokens. At this point I'll just keep cards on top, since we have enough in the graveyard already. Might still be able to get to a point where I have a bunch of plants that can shoot the opponent's flyers, and then we can survive the next attack, even if we don't win right now. Alright, we timed out. So now I need to somehow survive all these flyers, which is going to be tricky, but not impossible. And then we could also just attack for lethal next turn. But yeah, given enough time last turn, I think we would have been able to just win the game. So I guess I could let my opponent attack first, line up some blocks, and then shoot the flyers. Even though our opponent does get to trigger the recruits each time as well. So it's gonna get pretty messy. So maybe I should shoot those first. So blocks are assigned, and wow, I can't believe it, their opponent scoops it up. So yeah, this would have been pretty complicated to go through, but first we need to make a bunch of mana. Then we need to start exhausting to deal damage. And every plant can exhaust once to deal 3 damage. So we could deal with the recruit and the token. Opponent gets a bunch of counters, and then we just need to mow down all the flyers. But that should be feasible with the amount of plants we have available that can still exhaust. And then once we deal with the flyers, we should be able to just survive and then attack back for lethal next turn, or just burn the opponent out by making a few more plants. But yeah, it feels like if our opponent maybe had used Lantern at some point, maybe in response to the Osteomancer activation, exiling my graveyard, they could have stopped some amount of damage, or just used it before we got to exile loot. But yeah, it was definitely a little sketchy, because we needed to fill the graveyard to have enough creatures to enable roots, but at the same time we didn't want to overcommit and have our entire graveyard get exiled. Although if they use Lantern to exile my graveyard, it also triggers roots at least once. So it was a bit of a balancing act. Alright, so we get to see our latest iteration of the black-green Insidious Roots deck in action, and this is one of those archetypes that just keeps getting better with every new expansion, as we keep getting more of those graveyard synergies. Mold Tender fits perfectly into the deck as a way to make mana, exile cards, and trigger Insidious Roots, very good with Tyvar as well, as we've seen, and then of course the interaction with Cauldron and Loot is incredibly powerful as well, even though it sometimes might be a little bit overkill, and you will have opening hands with Loot in them that's not remotely castable, so there are definitely drawbacks to including it, but I've been having a lot of fun with this version, even though you sometimes threaten to crash the game and things will slow down to a crawl, making it difficult to actually click through everything to actually win the game, so you are definitely relying on some goodwill from your opponents to concede at some points. So maybe not the ideal deck to play on Arena, definitely wouldn't recommend to play it on mobile, but if you've got some time spare to click through all the buttons, then it can be a fun adventure. So that's going to do it for today's gameplay. I want to thank you for watching, hope you enjoyed, and as always, have a nice day.